For the first 25 days of December, we're going to be doing a readathon for my newest book, Nick. We know this isn't for everyone, so if you don't want us to read you a bedtime story every night, we'll still have our regular vlogs every Tuesday.
But if you do want to come along, then come on!
Alright guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be reading chapter 20, That's a Yeti. The sun had just begun to sneak around the snow-capped mountains, its warm rays spilling across the tops of the forest nestled below. The nocturnal animals had just returned home after an active night of hunting, while mammals and critters who slept throughout the night came scurrying or trotting out from their caves and hollows. The forest was quiet, just the occasional snapping twig or crunching snow, yet it was so alive to anyone patient enough to listen. An owl swooped down from the brightening sky, diving into the treetops, settling back in its nest while hooting its final hoots before bed. Arctic fox pups came tumbling out of their burrows to wrestle in the snow, all while a clan of badgers roamed by, uninterested and undisturbed. Buzzing beetles flew onto branches where squirrels scurried along scavenging for nuts and berries. Beavers built their dams down in the rapid-flowing river that splashed with salmon struggling to swim against the raging current. Majestic reindeers took to the forest, looking regal as ever as they roamed quietly through the trees with antlers held high like the crowns of royals. It was a typical morning for all the inhabitants of the forest. A forest sprawled across a range of snowy mountains. That is, until two children and one field mouse appeared out of thin air, screaming as they tumbled down a slushy hillside. The owl fluttered back awake. The beaver shot out of the wild rivers, and the herd of reindeer halted their trek through the forest to see what all the ruckus was about. None of the animals had ever seen a creature as strange as humans before. Nick couldn't slow down. His speed only increased as he tumbled along. He dodged pine trees, swerved from the path of jagged rocks, and still couldn't brake. He slid into a forest at the bottom of the hill, where he eventually glided to a stop on a patch of sleek ice. He had just got onto his feet when Emma came barreling down and took him out. They crashed on top of each other, feeling bruised and immediately sore. Even Gilbert was aching. He crawled out of Nick's pocket, ventured off onto the ice, grew dizzy, and collapsed right onto his furry bottom. Well, that wasn't very fun. Nick dusted powdered snow off his trousers. How about we don't do that again? Works for me. Emma rolled up her pants to check on a new scrape on her knee. That's the first and last time I'll be riding a train. I was referring to the Cracker Barrel, corrected Nick. Would it have been too much trouble for it to have given us a proper landing for a change? He circled in place, checking their surroundings from every angle. A forest of thin, quaking aspen trees, bare and looking like skeletons due to the heart of the winter season, spread thickly up to the high peaks of the mountain range they were on. The forest split down the cliffs, sprawling for miles upon miles at every turn. Nick felt swept up by a deluge of overwhelming emotion. Where are we? Emma already had her map out and was viewing it more closely than even their surroundings. It looks like we're in Finland now, a bit of a ways out from a town called Rovaniemi. Emma took a few steps forward, watching for the direction her painted replica was moving. If we head through there, she pointed to the thicket of thin, white-barked aspen, we'll reach the city. She hesitated but ultimately decided to finish, this time tomorrow morning. Tomorrow morning? Nick whined, already feeling defeated. Unfortunately, he sighed. Well, I guess we should get started. He scooped Gilbert up from the ice and then sat him on his shoulder. Let's go. They strolled off into the forest, within the grove of aspen and beneath the blaze of the morning sun. Unlike Dunderwoods, this forest was without a path to guide them along their way. Emma had to utilize her map a great deal more than she normally would have, as it was their only guide through the dense Finland forest. It wasn't long until the animals started to become aware of the children's presence. Hunters were not prone to traveling this far from their villages, and so high up on the mountains. The forest creatures had no reason to be frightened of humans. They were more curious than anything. Nick noticed a herd of elk as they were eating plants. The interruption caused them to crane their necks, watching as the peculiar human creatures wandered by. They then caught the interest of a curious brown bear who was sitting in the shallows of the river, taking a break from fishing to watch them cross the river by skipping from one surface stone to the next. Even wild rabbits weren't wary of them. They followed the children through the trees, hopping alongside Emma as they went. Morning turned into afternoon, and afternoon into early evening, but they stopped only to eat. Luckily, the forest was fruitful, even in the dead of winter. Nick and Emma enjoyed blueberries, cloudberries, lingonberries, and even the occasional hazelnut. Gilbert, on the other hand, wasn't very hungry. He nibbled on a blueberry, but nothing more. Nick was beginning to worry about his friend. He hadn't wanted to mention it before, but it had grown undeniably clear. Every day, Gilbert was becoming more and more like a mouse. Nick wished he had a remedy to cure his fuzzy little friend, even if just his mind. He was growing even more concerned with whether or not Gilbert would remain a mouse forever. Poor Gilbert, Nick thought while he watched the field mouse bathing himself on his shoulder. He was supposed to be adopted in just a few days, but Gilbert's new parents would be in for quite the surprise if they were to arrive at Lost Star Orphanage to find that their new son had magically transformed into a field mouse. It was just another reason why magic was so dangerous and, in Nick's opinion, not to be trusted. This got Nick thinking about his and Emma's future. They were in Finland, only Russia and the Arctic Ocean now standing between them and CLAUS village. If they were fortunate enough to save the children and return home to New York City, what would happen to all of them? Sister Meriwether was gone, and so were all the other nuns who looked after them. Would new nuns be sent to care for them, or would they be left to fend for themselves? Nick glanced back at Emma. She was trailing behind, nose wedged between the folds of her enchanted map, not looking where she was going. That's when a memory slipped into Nick's head. He remembered Emma trying to run away from Lost Star Orphanage, and it left him wondering if she might do it again. She didn't feel the same way about the orphanage as he did. She had spent no longer than a day there, but Nick had lived there for nearly his entire life. It was his home, the only one he'd ever known. He watched Emma nibbling on her fingernail while studying her map, a quirk of hers that he always found endearing. That's when Nick realized Lost Star Orphanage wouldn't be much of a home without her. He fell into a daze while looking at her. It took him an extra second to realize that his foot had slumped down into a slight ditch indented into the snow. Emma caught him from tripping over. "Are you all right?" "Yes, But he didn't know what had happened or how he had almost tripped. He lifted his foot and peeked underneath, finding the indent in the snow. "What's this?" He and Emma took a giant step back, and it was then that they saw it. It wasn't a ditch, but a footprint. And what a massive footprint it was. It was hominoid, complete with 5 toes, but half the size of Nick's body. "That's a big footprint," Nick licked his lips and swallowed. "That's a really big footprint." Emma had strolled off course, ducking into the trees a few yards away in wild growth. "Nick," she started with a cold shiver in her voice, "you might want to see this." Emma seemed to have followed a trail of the massive footprints in a different direction than they had been headed. To make it to her, Nick swatted branches and trudged through blueberry shrubs. He joined her in the frame of tall, thin aspens slouching in wild shrubbery while gazing off into a clearing. Nick, Emma, and even Gilbert had to blink a few times to be sure what they were seeing was really there. It was a gigantic, ape-like creature tangled in thick, matted fur, bone-white and filthy. The potent odor hadn't hit them until that moment, and they couldn't believe it hadn't. The wild creature reeked of wild dog times 1,000. It was so awful that Emma had to plug her nose, and Nick had to tuck his under the collar of his shirt. Gilbert had to cover his little snout with his claws. They kept staring at the beast, crouched to his knees, tearing into its kill. A beautiful reindeer lay dead in the snow. A puddle of its blood stained the frost while the monster that had hunted it down indulged itself. That's... Nick took a cold breath and finished with a shout. "That's a Yeti!" The Yeti whipped around, but luckily Emma was swift. She tackled Nick into the blueberry bush where she covered his mouth. The Yeti snorted puffs of cold air, grunting as it turned back to rip into the reindeer. Emma kept her palm pressed firmly against Nick's lips. "Don't scream, you got that?" Nick nodded dumbly, feeling foolish for shouting so loud and drawing the monster's attention. Emma pulled her hand back, and together they parted the bush and slowly peeked out from the shrubbery. The Yeti sat on its butt like an ape, its massive hands tearing into the reindeer. Searching for parts of its innards the creature felt worthy enough to eat. Nick had to cover his eyes for most of it, but Emma didn't stray her attention. Luckily she hadn't, because she might not have noticed Gilbert's satchel sitting in the snow directly beside the Yeti's shaggy leg. Until then she hadn't even realized it was missing. She gathered they must have lost it somewhere between vanishing off the train, appearing in a forest, and rolling down a hill. Nick She nudged him with her elbow, but his head was tilted away and his eyes were clamped tightly shut. For crying out loud, open your eyes! Nick reluctantly peeled his eyes back open and followed Emma's pointed finger to Gilbert's satchel, inches from the Yeti. I guess we can kiss that satchel goodbye, he muttered. Kiss it goodbye? Are you kidding me? Emma insisted. Nick, we have to get it back. He tried to collect his thoughts. Let me get this straight. You want to get Gilbert's satchel back from the Yeti that is currently in the middle of eating the corpse of a reindeer. We have to. All of our things are in there. Things that have saved our lives on multiple occasions. Nick stressed his words. Yeti eating the corpse of a reindeer. It still wasn't sinking in. And so Nick turned to the mouse on his shoulder. What do you think, Gilbert? But Gilbert only stared back at him with a pair of beady black eyes, a wrinkled nose, and twitching whiskers. What was that, Gilbert? Nick pretended to listen while Emma rolled her eyes and allowed him to continue with his performance. It seems Gilbert agrees with me. I guess we'll just have to go on without his satchel. He took one step off in a different direction when Emma snatched his earlobe and yanked him back into the blueberry shrub bush. We're getting Gilbert's satchel and that's the end of it, all right? Nick nodded, and so she released him. He rubbed his ear. You know that really hurts. Shh! Emma ducked further into the bush and watched as the Yeti finished eating. Once it was done, it snatched the satchel while rising to its massive, hairy feet. It scratched its butt and then stomped through the forest. Come on! A Yeti, Nick cried and complained. Why would anyone ever follow a Yeti into the woods? But he had no choice but to follow Emma, hopping from one tree, then on to the next, all while pursuing the Yeti from a distance. The creature was monstrously tall. The girth of its belly caused it to sag to its knees, and its body was covered in matted white fur. It was hard to lose sight of it while it trudged along through the forest. Logs snapped like twigs beneath its heavy feet, while bushes crumbled and trees bent or broke out of its directed line of travel. Nick and Emma hid behind aspens and ducked behind boulders, racing from one hiding spot to the next. Emma had her eyes on the satchel swaying in the Yeti's tight grip, while Nick kept closer attention to the beast picking its dinner out of its pointy fangs. They were beginning to get tired. To keep up with the Yeti's pace meant that they had to sprint just so that they wouldn't lose it. Nick was starting to sweat, and Emma could feel the development of an awful pinch in her side. Gilbert, on the other hand, sat on Nick's shoulder thinking over all the different types of cheeses there were in the world, and only hoped he would be lucky enough to sample them all. Nick and Emma didn't know how much more running they had in them, and were just about to give up when the Yeti marched right into a camp. Emma grabbed Nick's hand and hurled him with her behind an aspen with a thick white trunk. They slowly peeked out from behind it, and that's when they realized that the camp was filled with at least a dozen Yetis. There were a whole clan of them, some adults, others children, and they all were gathered around a fire, grunting and snorting as their form of communication. The Yeti they had been trailing tossed Gilbert's satchel into a tall pile of new and old trinkets that had been scavenged throughout what seemed like many years. Nick noticed many peculiar items amongst the collection, including a carriage wheel, a few luggage, hordes of clothing, broken lanterns, old hats, some pottery, and most of all, shoes. An obsessive amount of shoes. Nick peeked out from behind the aspen with a quick, sweeping gaze at the campsite. There's no getting the satchel. Now, he determined. Now, not with a dozen Yetis surrounding it. Emma massaged her chin. Not exactly. He slapped himself lightly on the cheek. Not another one of your bright ideas. Listen, she leaned closer and whispered. Remember the music box Olivia gave me? Nick fought the urge from rolling his eyes. You mean the toy from Mr. McTwizzle's toy shop? It's not just a toy. It's enchanted with the fairy's voice. Olivia said if played, it could put anyone who listens to sleep. Yes, but you're forgetting, Emma. Olivia's music box is in Gilbert's satchel. He tilted his head, gesturing to the pile of trinkets where the bag sat on top like the cherry on an ice cream sundae. All we have to do is get to the satchel, find the music box, play it, cover our ears, and then make a run for it. Nick faked a smile. Oh yes, a suicide mission. It'll work, trust me. Emma might have sounded confident about it, but Nick certainly didn't share her optimism. He took another peek out from behind the aspen, listening to the beastly snorts and monstrous grunts of the Yeti family while they tore through ligaments of animal carcasses. His imagination took the best of him, and before long he was envisioning the Yetis devouring him the same as they were those animal corpses. He didn't like the image in his head. In fact, he didn't like it at all. In his opinion, Emma had put them in plenty of dangerous situations before, but this time she had gone too far. Nick knew he had to put his foot down before one of them ended up getting hurt or even worse. Just when he turned to her to share his concerns, he realized Emma was gone. He worked his way around the tree, scouring around frantically, but coming up short of finding her. That's when Gilbert squeaked from on his shoulder. He pointed his claw over to the campsite. The Yetis were circled around the fire, and behind them in the shadows, Emma worked her way through the trees while drawing closer to the pile of trinkets. Nick looked at Gilbert and Gilbert at him. "This girl is going to get us killed," he said while Gilbert buried his fuzzy snout in his claws and shook his head. It was a nail-biting situation. Nick and Gilbert waited for Emma behind the aspen, watching nervously as their friend made her way toward the mountain of oddities. The Yetis remained oblivious of Emma, totally unaware that a teenage girl had snuck into their camp. They continued to snort and grunt, chuckling after one of the gigantic beasts grumbled something that could only be assumed as amusing. 2 Yeti cubs wrestled in the snow. A mother nursed her young, all while the others passed around a slab of meat, taking turns tearing into the carcass between mutters and growls, during which Emma was making progress toward Gilbert's satchel. She got to the foot of the pile of trinkets and jumped, but couldn't reach the satchel as it was just barely out of reach. She jumped again, but missed for a second time. "Come on, Emma!" Nick clenched his fists, digging his fingernails into his red, sweaty palms. "You've almost got it!" Gilbert seized his long, thin tail and squeezed while he watched in suspense as Emma struggled to reach for his satchel. Emma rose her foot up onto a briefcase, reached for a carriage wheel, and then lifted herself up the mountain of odd trinkets. She then moved her foot up onto a lantern wedged sturdily amongst mounds of furniture pieces, reached for the heel of a woman's shoe, found it was loose, lost her support, and before she knew it, she fell back and landed in the snow. Nick watched horrified as the mountain of trinkets came tumbling down with loud crashes. All the Yetis whipped around to find Emma coming out from the pile with Gilbert's satchel in her hands. Their roar was deafening. It was a pitch so high that Nick could feel it vibrating in his bones. It was powerful as well. The nearby trees buckled. The surrounding snow picked up in gusts and flocks of birds took to the sky, all due to the Yeti's collective roar. Emma, now surrounded by the Yeti clan, stood drenched in green snot and sticky mucus. She was paralyzed with terror, so frightened that she must have forgotten all about Olivia's music box buried in the satchel in her hands. "Run," Nick whispered while watching the Yetis tightening their circle around her. "Come on, Emma, get out of there." The Yetis exchanged grunts, suggesting they were deciding on who between them would get the privilege to eat Emma first. Would the honor be bestowed to the tallest in the clan or the ugliest amongst them, the most aggressive, wisest, or even the one who smelled the worst? While they decided, Emma shivered between them, squeezing the handle of Gilbert's satchel, nervously eyeing each of the Yeti's enormous mouths all filled with great, sharp teeth. Nick thought quickly and came to an idea he already regretted. "Hey!" he shouted loud enough to capture all the Yeti's attention. "Yeah, you, the ugly one!" He twisted around, pushed his butt out, and shook it about. "Come on and get me!" At once, all the Yetis stomped in the snow and roared. The trees bent, a few even snapped, and a forceful gust hurled Nick straight into the snow, face first. Emma finally broke through her fear. "Nick, run!" The Yeti charged, each thunderous step quaking the earth. Nick got himself up just in time to see a dozen of them, hairy, ginormous, and grotesque, stampeding toward him. He felt an explosion of nerves detonate inside him. "Oh no, what have I done?" Gilbert squeaked frantically in his ear, a squeak that was obviously shouting run, and so Nick did. He took off through the trees, dodging aspens, bounding over fruitful shrubberies, and climbing over fallen logs, but the Yetis were gaining on him. He raced onward, losing his breath the more he pushed himself, before he skidded to a stop right on the edge of a steep cliff. He spun back around, and there was the clan of Yeti surrounding him from all sides, nudging him slowly toward the edge. Nick backed away until his heels finally met the end of the cliff, leaving tiny rocks to shower down into the valley far, far below. "Well, Gilbert," he turned to the field mouse trembling on his shoulder, "it was really nice knowing you." The Yetis advanced, each step sending a rumble beneath Nick and loosening more tiny rocks, sending them all pouring off the cliff. Nick and Gilbert pinched their eyes closed, bracing themselves for death as the many Yeti towered over them. Nick could feel their warm, potent breath crashing over him, and could hear their thirsty growls as they vibrated against his eardrums. But then, a most beautiful melody filled the air, the sweetest song Nick had ever heard. It was angelic, each word relaxing his body until he felt like he hadn't the strength to stand any longer. He fell to his knees. Peeling his eyes open took far more willpower than he even had. All the Yetis started to drop around him, slumping down until they were curled up fast asleep. Nick struggled to keep his eyes open. They slowly began to close, but not before catching a glimpse of Emma emerging from within the trees with Olivia's music box opened in her hands. Alright guys, come back tomorrow for chapter 21. Comment.